Hello, this is Scott Turner. I'm Director of Science Programs at the National Association of Scholars, and this is the Week in Science for the 8th of May 2025. I'm glad you're here. This was a big week. Following the celebrations last week of President Trump's first 100 days in office, Science magazine jumped in with its own celebrations. Well, lamentations, really. Let's jump in. Donald Trump's first 100 days have not been good ones for the special interest lobbying group that publishes Science magazine. I speak of the AAAS. For them, it's been a, quote, chaotic 100-day push, close quote, to demolish vast swathes of the federal government's scientific and public health infrastructure. Entire agencies that fund research have been erased. Thousands of federal workers with technical backgrounds have been unceremoniously pushed out. Most importantly, it seems, the health needs of the entire LGBTQ community are being put in jeopardy. Sounds pretty ominous. This being Science magazine, there are graphs for the data-minded showing that science spending has plummeted, workforce funding has been slashed, and, most sadly, big research universities have taken a big hit. Oh no! Well, anyway. An editorial by Holden Thorpe, the editor-in-chief of Science magazine, sets the tone for what he calls the new reality for American education. Well, we can always hope. The problem, he explains, is that the public has lost trust in American higher education and in scientific research, and somehow that trust needs to be restored. Okay, but he's only waking up to this now? Maybe we should explain ourselves better, Holden says. Maybe we should thank the public more. Which just begs the question, are you saying this just because the money is being taken away? Reminds me a bit of a petulant teenager. Thorpe's masquerade of humility is not helped by characterizing right off the bat the Trump administration's endless churn of damaging actions. How mean of them. And it gets worse. Near the end, he analogizes the Trump cuts to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Well, that'll win friends. I hate to break the news, but public trust in science has been eroding for decades now, and it's mostly been self-inflicted. Universities and science have always had ample opportunity to maintain the public's trust, and unfortunately, they've consistently blown it. So why should we think they'll start now, if they're given back their allowance? Next up is a lamentation about the impacts on the country's largest funder of biomedical research, the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. The NIH is besieged, you see, by the twin demons of Donald Trump and Elon Musk's Doge army. It's all gloom and doom at the NIH, and an atmosphere of, quote, chaos and fear and frustration and anger prevails. Okay, well, there certainly have been a fair number of job cuts, 2,500, which amounts to a little over 12% of the NIH's total workforce. Don't you think that the NIH can continue at 85% of its current staffing? I think maybe they can. Also, most of the layoffs were for so-called probationary employees, either new hires or, and this is interesting, senior people who voluntarily gave up their tenured positions at the NIH. One of the conditions of being a probationary employee in any industry is that you really have no expectation of permanent employment. It's a pretty standard feature of probationary employment. Okay, well, there are also those grants being suspended or cut. But look between the lines. The cuts seem mostly to be grants concerned with political priorities that once might have been favored, but no longer are. LGBTQ, transgender, environmental justice, those sorts of things. There were also a lot of tragic stories about careers being cut short or being pushed into uncertainty. Again, look between the lines. One researcher interviewed for this article said that he had already made a self-deportation plan. He intends to go back to China, and I'm sure he'll have a good landing place there. The supposedly crippling cuts in indirect costs that began this crisis in February also made an appearance. Crippling? Please. Indirect costs have long been overinflated and out of kilter with legitimate overhead costs. They need to be cut. And cutting them will mean more money for research, not less. As for the new administration coming in and making all these changes, maybe a reminder would be apt right now. The NIH is a government agency. It exists to implement a government agenda. The government has changed, and along with it, the agenda. And this is what happens when you work for the government. The new Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., comes in for particular ire. Well, the NIH and RFK Jr. are not, shall we say, friends. Which brings us back to those trust issues that Holden Thorpe brought up. There are serious problems with the NIH, and these problems have existed for a long time. I can only point to Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci. All I can suggest is read it with an open mind. Remember AIDS? Remember COVID-19? Remember EcoHealth Alliance? The NIH has been at the center of all that and more, and for many years. In other words, the NIH has amply earned its mistrust. And the place to start in earning back that trust is to clean house. And that's just what is going on at the NIH right now. Again, we can only hope. But won't the sledgehammer approach to funding cuts harm innocent researchers just doing their jobs and just starting out on their careers? That's the theme of this article about the human impact of the Trump budget cuts. The authors sought out 5 early career researchers to tell their stories. Included in the article were pencil sketches of the 5 individuals, and here they are. Their pencil sketches were probably intended to put a human face to their stories, but to me, they all just look sort of angry. Now, human interest stories like this one are not reporting. They're not meant to be, really. They're written to advance a specific agenda, and that's fine. An approach like this can humanize complicated issues and put them into a different perspective. But we always have to keep in mind what the agenda is. The subtitle lays out the agenda pretty clearly. Quote, behind the myriad upheavals U.S. science has faced during the first 100 days of the administration, countless researchers are fighting for their careers and aspirations. Here are 5 who face uncertain futures. Here are the real victims of the Trump budget cuts, you see. Quote, promising scientists that are fighting for their careers and aspirations. Close quote. Well, if you put it that way, who wouldn't be sympathetic? But there's that agenda in there, lurking between the lines. For one thing, each of the 5 researchers chosen ticks one diversity box or another. Where's the message there? The subtext seems to be, end of the world, women and minorities hit hardest. And their specific complaints? Let me paraphrase. It's hard to pivot and do something else. Okay, well, what about resiliency? The uncertainty is too much to gamble on, so I'm going to Canada or Europe. Sorry, but you're unlikely to find a friendlier environment there. I might have to go to private foundations to fund my surveys on LGBTQ feelings about crime. Well, there is a lot of private money out there. Why not go for it? If I have to leave my position, competition for other positions is so intense that my career may come to an end. Maybe that's a sign that we've been overproducing young scientists. Just a thought. I'm actually sympathetic to these people's plights. Hey, we've all been there. But that's the nature of building a high-risk career, isn't it? And careers in science are pretty high risk. Uncertainty and anxiety go with the territory, especially early in one's career when actually you're being screened precisely to see if you have the resiliency, creativity, determination, and imagination to plow through obstacles just like these. I suspect these individuals know that. They seem clear eyed about the new landscape that's building up around them. But the authors of this piece did them no favors by portraying them as whiny victims. If the last 100 days were pretty bad, what about the next 100? It's only going to get worse, according to Science magazine. Currently, the federal government spends about $200 billion each year on research, and about half of that goes to support university research. That is a great deal of money. The Trump administration is looking to shave about 50% off that spending. Okay, that sounds pretty bad. But to put this in perspective, government science funding doubles roughly every 7 years. So, a 50% cut would return us to the spending levels of 7 years ago, in 2018. We somehow made do then. Can't we make do now? Well, apparently not. But there's always hope. Maybe Congress will rescue us. They always have, after all. Or maybe Doge will go away. Just don't take our money away. And now for the news. Science magazine has a regular news section. This week's consists of 6 articles, 4 of which are about the Trump assault on science. This article outlines the hairy details of the Trump budget cuts. The cuts are uneven. The NIH budget will be cut 40%, losing $18 billion. The NSF will take the biggest cut, down 55%, most of it for, quote, broadening participation, quote, grants, which is code speak for DEI. NASA also takes a big hit, down 53%, most of it in climate modeling satellite programs, which actually the private sector is invested in big time. The Department of Energy gets off lightly, losing about 14% of its funding, nearly all of it in green energy programs. Sounds right to me. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration also gets off lightly, losing about 24%, mostly from, quote, climate-dominated research, close quote. And the same thing applies for the U.S. Geological Survey and the Department of Agriculture, again focused on the Biden era's expansion of climate change research. Add it all up, and there's still nearly $70 billion in science spending. Always look on the bright side of life. But no, the bad news just keeps piling up. The NIH will no longer allow grants to be shared with foreign scientists. In case you miss the point, this, quote, borders on the insane, close quote. Does anyone recollect EcoHealth Alliance and the NIH's support of viral research in Wuhan? Maybe subsidizing foreign researchers isn't such a good plan. There's also a handy Trump tracker feature in there, which frets, among other things, about Health and Human Services now taking a second look at so-called trans youth care. Overdue, it seems to me. If that was not bad enough, the NIH is going to dismantle a training program for deaf researchers. That sounds cruel. But it's not about, say, curing deafness. It's a DEI program, which so far has consumed about $10 million. The researchers involved in this claim that this is just a, quote, drop in the bucket for the NIH's budget. So, cutting it won't save much money. Why take it away? At the same time, they say that, quote, the idea that private funding will step in is not realistic, close quote. Well, why isn't it if it's just a drop in the bucket? Also, there won't be funding anymore for disinformation research, which means we'll no longer be spending federal money on the Center for Countering Digital Hate. The name says it all. And there was this gratuitous quote dropped in without connection to any of the news stories. Stupid Trump and his miscalculations. And that's the way it is in Science News, May 8th, 2025. Well, that's all pretty bad. So let's close on something lighter. A documentary I recently saw about scientific and medical fraud. The documentary is called Bad Surgeon. You can see it on Netflix. It's worth a view. Bad Surgeon is not really about science per se. The science itself is embedded in a larger story, the gist of which you can get from the subtitle, Love Under the Knife. I'll say no more on that. Watch the documentary. But there is a sub-story in there about fraud in science and medicine and how our institutions ignore it, or even enable it. Paolo Macchiarini is an Italian surgeon who claimed to have developed a novel surgical treatment for people with damaged windpipes. He would make a plastic model of a damaged trachea, infuse it with stem cells, and implant it into the patients. And eventually the stem cells would regenerate a new trachea around the plastic model, which would eventually be replaced by a new living trachea. As the saying goes, it sounded like a good idea at the time. He became an international medical celebrity, and he was, for a time, a candidate for the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. Just one problem, it was all made up. He had never tested his procedure on animals first, as is the normal practice. He just went straight to humans. He operated on or assisted operations for about a dozen patients. In some instances, the implanted plastic trachea had no stem cells at all in it. Nearly all his patients died, and in horrible circumstances. So Macchiarini seems not even to have been a competent physician. Nevertheless, he kept his grift going, shielded by his celebrity, adoring press coverage, and the uncritical support of hospitals and medical institutes worldwide. Among his enablers was the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. The Karolinska just loved him for the reflected glory and the money that he brought in. Some of his surgical colleagues began to sniff a rat, though, and they eventually unraveled the web of lies that Macchiarini had woven. So they did the right thing. They went to the Karolinska leadership, expecting them to do the right thing too. And that was where things took another dark turn. Remarkably, the Karolinska Institute turned on the whistleblowers. They found themselves under investigation and even were referred to the police for criminal offenses. They had to leave their positions. They were a threat, you see, to the source of a lot of money and prestige, the fraudulent and homicidal Paolo Macchiarini. Why do I bring this up? As Holden Thorpe acknowledged in this week's Science magazine, finally acknowledged, I would say, science has a trust issue with the public. We rely on scientists and their institutions to act with integrity, to do the right thing, and often they don't. To the Karolinska Institute, Paolo Macchiarini was the source of considerable money and prestige, and the whistleblowers threatened that. Therefore, it was they who had to be purged, not Paolo Macchiarini. It was only once the extent of Macchiarini's fraud became too big to ignore that the Karolinska took action. Maybe that's what's happening now in our own scientific institutions. Taking the money away is certainly getting people's attention. Again, the documentary is Bad Surgeon. Have a watch on Netflix. Okay, that's it for the Week in Science for May 8th, 2025. Visit us on the National Association of Scholars YouTube page. And visit us also on the National Association of Scholars website at nas.org. If you enjoyed this, please consider joining us as a member. And if you're already a member, thanks for your ongoing support. See you next week.